You've served in the U.S. military for many years, achieving rank of lieutenant colonel. You were deployed in Iraq in 2004 and 5, Kuwait in 2008 and 9. What lessons about life and about country have you learned from that experience of war?
So many. Central to those lessons learned was having my eyes open to the very real cost of war. Of course, I served in a medical unit during that first deployment to Iraq. It was 2005 during the height of that war. And unfortunately, we took a lot of casualties. We, across the entire U.S. military, my brigade that I deployed with was from the Hawaii National Guard. We had approximately 3,000 soldiers who were operating in 4 different areas of Iraq. And my first task every day was to go through a list of every injury, combat-related injury that had occurred the day before in the country. And I went through that list name by name, looking to see if any one of our nearly 3,000 soldiers from Hawaii had been hurt in the line of duty. And then if seeing them on the list, tracking them down, where were they? Were they getting the care they needed? Would they be able to get sufficient care to stay in country and return to duty? Did I need to get them evacuated? Usually it would be to military hospitals that at that time were in Landstuhl and Ramstein in Germany. And then from there, getting them to either Brooke Army Medical Center, which was here in Texas, that specialized in burn-related injuries, or to Walter Reed, and tracking them and their care until they were finally home with their families. And it never became a routine task. It never became like, okay, cool, check the list, kind of dot the I's, cross the T's. It was that daily confrontation with the reality of the cost of war. Friends of mine were killed in combat. Experiencing firsthand that high human cost of war caused me, 20-something-year-old from Hawaii, I'd left my seat in the state legislature to volunteer to deploy with my brothers and sisters in my unit to Iraq. And so recognize the cost of war, I think, in 2 fundamental ways. Number one is the high human cost of war on our troops and on the people in the country where this war was being waged, and also the cost on American taxpayers. Seeing then back, again, 2005, and recognizing KBR Halliburton, one of the biggest defense contracting companies then, and I know that they are still very much in that business now. Dick Cheney being connected with that company at one point or another. But in our camp specifically, which was one of the larger ones in Iraq at that time, there wasn't anything that happened in our camp that didn't have the KBR Halliburton logo imprinted on it. We had a big shack-looking place where we ate our meals. They call it a dining facility, a DFAC in the military. And they served 4 meals a day. They brought in, and they being KBR Halliburton, they imported workers in from places like Nepal and Sri Lanka and the Philippines to come in and cook food and work at this dining facility. I got curious about how much it cost us as taxpayers. And so I started asking around some of the people, and I think at that time it was like, well, every time a soldier or a service member walks through the door, if I were to go in for breakfast and grab a banana and walk out, that's an automatic $35 per head, per meal, 4 times a day, thousands and thousands of people. And then we made friends. There's a pretty large Filipino community in Hawaii, a lot of Filipino soldiers from Hawaii. We made friends with the Filipino workers who were there. They would often go in the back of the tents and set up their own rice cookers and cook their own meals, which is where the real good food was. But just started talking to them and getting to know them and asked hey, how much do you get paid? And on average, it was I get paid $500 a month. $500 a month to go and do this work of either, cleaning out porta potties, picking up trash, the dining facility, doing laundry, all of these different tasks, because the military wanted soldiers to be out doing things that only soldiers could do. Understandable. But when I started putting, 2 and 2 together and knowing that this company, one company alone, was making trillions of dollars, and yet this Filipino mom is making $500 a month, maybe getting 1 day off a week, maybe working 12 hours a day otherwise. And I said, how often are you able to go home to your family? Well, they'll let us go home a couple of weeks every other year. It was an eye-opening experience that growing up in Hawaii, I frankly hadn't given much thought to before. But it's what led me ultimately coming back from that first deployment. There was no way that I could go back to the life that I had left behind. And I knew somehow, some way, I needed to find a way to use those experiences to try to make a positive impact, to try to influence those, frankly, the politicians who were making decisions to go and launch these regime change wars and send our men and women in uniform into war, and to what end, ultimately.
If we can just go back to that list.
Yeah.
So the list is just name and injury. Name and injury.
Name, unit, potentially location, if someone had documented that, and their injury.
And it's just pages and pages of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I knew, I didn't get to call home every day, but when I called home and talked to my parents, I felt the tension in their voice. And, they didn't want me to worry about anything at home. And so they were always like, hey, how are you? What can we send you? And this and that. But, it wasn't like I was calling them from down the street and saying, hey, how's it going? Let's go have lunch or whatever. And so I knew that the reason for that tension was they were terrified of getting a phone call delivering the worst possible news. And that was what I thought of as I went through that list of how, it is the reality of war. Behind every one of those names on that list was, a husband or a wife, parents, sons and daughters, family members, who had no idea what we were dealing with, really. All they knew was what they saw on the news. And what my dad told me later when I got home after that deployment was that every time they saw the news and they saw a helicopter shot down or crashed or some IED, they held their breath until they saw or heard the news of who it was or what it was.
What can you say about what the soldiers had to go through physically and psychologically when they get injured?
The physical, some injuries appeared to be minor up front. At that time, traumatic brain injury was not something that was talked about much, if at all. And so, many had visible wounds. Others are now what we know appeared like, all right, cool, you checked out, but had invisible wounds. Those who were injured in a way that did not allow them to get back to work found it emotionally very difficult to be put on a plane and evacuated out of there, feeling guilty that they were leaving their friends behind, and not thinking about themselves or not feeling bad for themselves, but instead feeling bad for being forced to be in a position to leave. For soldiers, it's not, of course, we all have our own political opinions on things, but when it comes right down to it, in a war zone, it's about your friends. It's about your brothers and sisters that you're serving alongside. It's not about the politicians or whatever insanity is going on in Washington. It's about getting up and going out, getting the job done, and coming back home together. I had friends of mine who were from Hawaii, who were from American Samoa, very culturally tight-knit community, who confided in me throughout that, year that we were there. Some of the very infantry soldiers who were going out on security patrols and doing raids every day. Just some of the very traumatic experiences that they went through. No physical injury, but creating a kind of emotional stress and trauma that as human beings, they were struggling in dealing with. on a positive note, Polynesian culture especially, but also Asian culture and other cultures around the world, our guys found that as they were shortly after we got there, the unit that we were replacing, we're taking the guys out on patrol and saying, hey, here's this village, here's where we found friendlies, or here's where we know that there are insurgents operating and they've got allies and lookouts, and, showing them the lay of the land, basically. And what our guys found was that as they were doing these ride-alongs, they call it a left seat, right seat, when you're coming in and taking over, that there was a bit of a tense, even adversarial type of relationship where on the military side, there was an assumption of suspicion or lack of trust, just with the local Iraqi people who lived around the base that we were at. And without anybody telling them to, culturally, our guys began trying to build relationships. And, for Hawaii and Samoa, and we had soldiers from Guam and Saipan, little things like you're riding down in a Humvee, you've got a gunner in the turret with a 50 cal or a machine gun of some sort, little things like pointing the muzzle to the sky as you're riding through a town rather than pointing it directly at where people are walking down the street was a huge gesture of an assumption of, hey, let's actually talk and become friends. We had our guys riding down the street and throwing shakas out to the local people there, breaking bread, sharing tea, and building those relationships. And again, I served in a medical unit, and what we saw was a downward shift in casualties from the unit that had been there before us, simply because of that basic human connection that our guys sought to make. And then gradually finding like, hey, local, people who lived in the town right next to us were saying, hey, you guys should really, somebody was digging a big hole a mile down the road. You might want to bypass that or check that out, and finding weapons caches and IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and other things that helped save people's lives.
On the cost side of things, how is it possible for a company like Halliburton or others to get away with $40 bananas, or however much it was? So the overhead costs.
Look, what they will claim is that it's expensive to move logistics through a country at war. But they get away with it, ultimately, this insane war profiteering, and they're not alone, obviously. There are other companies that this is their business model. They get away with it because of their political connections and the lobbyists that they have, the relationships they have with politicians, and ultimately what President Eisenhower warned against with regard to that cozy relationship between Congress and even what he called then the military-industrial complex. It's been alive and well. He warned us against it, and I would say it's thriving more now than ever before.
How powerful is the military-industrial complex as a thing? Is it a machine that can be slowed down, can be stopped, can be reversed?
It can be. It's powerful. I don't think you can overstate the powerful nature of it, because it extends so deeply within our government. It's not just those in these specific big defense contracting companies that benefit from it. You look at the revolving door within the Pentagon, for example, where you have both high-ranking people who wear military uniforms, as well as those who serve as high-ranking Department of Defense civilians who are literally working their way into a big payout when they leave that job. We see it with our own Secretary of Defense now. He retired as a general officer, went and served on one of the boards for one of the big defense contractors, and then now back as the Secretary of Defense. We see the same thing in Congress with members of Congress and senior professional staffers in Congress. Same exact revolving door where you have people, whether they're writing contracts for the Department of Defense for the company that then wins the bid for that contract and then going and working for that company, or those in Congress who are writing policies and doing exactly the same thing.